Okay, Barbara, we're live.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on what's going to be an exciting adventure. It's going to be even more exciting for me because I was just telling our author, Ann William and Doug Preston, that this is the first Zoom event we've ever done where I have not either seen the book or read the book. And the reason is that they're all in Doug's office in Santa Fe, where Lucky Doug is going to have to unpack them and sign them and ship them to us. Now, I will say, with apologies, that we sent Doug 600 books. We thought it was enough. They're completely sold out, but we have established a wait list for Lost Cities, and Doug will be at the Poison Pen on February 15th with his with Lincoln. Although Lincoln won't be live, but Doug will be live with Diablo Mesa, which is their new Nora Kelly and Corey Swanson book. And Doug can then sign all the copies of Lost Cities that we will have then. So you're just going to have to wait if you didn't pre-order the book. Then we're sorry about that. But Doug, it's your fault because you did such a great promotion. You just blew it out of the water. So you're the guy who wrote the introduction. So why don't I sit back and turn this over to you, and you can tell us how wonderful this book is and all about it.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Well, I'll show everyone a copy of the book. It is a beautiful, massive book, and it's beautifully illustrated. It's anyway, it's really, I'm very, very pleased to be part of this book. They asked me to write the introduction, Lost Cities and Ancient Tombs, and it's 100 discoveries that changed the world, archaeological discoveries, but archaeology conceived very broadly. I mean, there's paleoarchaeology in here. There's all kinds of extremely interesting, fabulous discoveries. And I actually wanted to ask Ann Williams, who's here with us, she's the editor of the book, how you chose these discoveries. I've been reading this book myself, and although I know a lot of these discoveries already, there are quite a few that I wasn't familiar with, and it's truly a fascinating read. So, but I'm curious, how did you select these?
Well, I entered this project from the beginning. This idea came from Hilary Black, who was an editor at National Geographic, a book editor. And I had been a writer at the magazine for many years, and I'm actually an archaeologist by training. And so Hilary knew of my work at the magazine, and she knew of my background in archaeology, and she thought I might be a good fit for this book. So she reached out to me and she said, look, task number one is to come up with a list of the 100 most interesting, spectacular, impactful archaeological discoveries ever. Well, so that was right in my wheelhouse because I had covered so many of them for National Geographic magazine. And I sat down at my computer and, within a pretty short time, I had 80 ideas. And then other people chimed in with other ideas. My husband came into my office one day. He's ex-Coast Guard. And he said, have you put the Mary Rose on the list? The Mary Rose was a warship belonging to King Henry VIII of England that sank off the south coast of England. And it was found, I think, in the 1960s. And because it had been underwater for so long, not only the timbers of the boat were intact, but all the contents. And so all of that was retrieved from the water, and it's in a museum in England now, and it just gives a fabulous snapshot of that place and that time. So that was his contribution. There was a lovely editorial assistant in National Geographic Books named Mariah Petty, and she had a couple of what I thought were fabulous ideas. She went on and on about something called the Riace bronzes. Well, I had never heard of them, and that was strange because I studied classical archaeology. The Riace bronzes were two large bronze statues, probably made somewhere in the Greek world in about 400 BC. And the theory was that they were on a ship bringing them to Rome to decorate some, wealthy person's villa. And the ship got into trouble. And these things weigh 300 pounds apiece. So the captain probably said, we're going to lose these statues. Heave them overboard. Fast forward to 1970, there was a scuba diver on vacation and snorkeling off the coast near Riace. His fin just swept a little bit of sand away, and there was an arm. I mean, he just about freaked out because he thought it was a dead person. Well, of course it was not. It was these two absolutely fabulously gorgeous statues, and archaeologists got involved, got them out of the water, got them to conservation labs, got them cleaned, and they are just absolutely stunning. So, it was a collaborative effort. There is another person, you probably know Fred Hebert, Doug. Fred Hebert is the staff archaeologist at the National Geographic Society, one of the smartest human beings on the planet. And he came up with quite a number of ideas as well. So, our mandate was to come up with things that really were spectacular and impactful. That's a long-winded answer to your very short question.
Well, it's a very interesting answer. My aunt, Dr. Anna McCann, was an underwater archaeologist, and she was actually America's first woman underwater archaeologist. And she started off diving with Jacques Cousteau and so forth. And she was involved in that Riace bronze discovery peripherally. And she told me that her theory was that those bronzes were in very shallow water. There was a scuba diver found them in very shallow water, and it was a big surprise to find them in such shallow water and not far from the coast. And she said that her thought was that looters, fishermen had brought them up from a deeper water in their nets somehow.
Uh-huh.
And then hid them in shallower water while they were trying to figure out what to do with them. And then they were discovered by that scuba diver.
Yeah.
But they are very impressive. They're larger than life. I think two of the greatest sculptures surviving from the Greek era. But
I think so. One of them is 6.5 inches, 6.5 feet. The other is 6.7 feet. And, you have to remember that people were much shorter in antiquity. So those sculptures really would be larger than life. The reason why these sculptures are impactful, I mean, yeah, they're gorgeous, but here's the thing. Back in those days, bronze was a very valuable metal, and so it was melted down as soon as somebody was finished with an object or an object had outlived its usefulness. And so we really do not have very many of these bronze statues from the classical world, which makes them, not only gorgeous, but they are rare.
Yeah, if they hadn't been heaved overboard, they probably wouldn't exist.
That's right.
Statues existed from Greek times because they were, the marble was repurposed. Many of them were burned to make cement.
Yeah.
But well, it's very interesting because the book, there are all kinds of stories in this book like that, of these really fabulous discoveries. And I remember when I was writing my introduction, of course, I was very happy that the lost city, the discovery of the pre-Columbian city in Honduras that I wrote about in my book, The Lost City of the Monkey God, was mentioned in this book as one of those 100 discoveries. I was very, very happy to read that. But in looking through the book, there was so many other interesting ones. There was one in particular that fascinated me, and that is the kurgans, the tombs of the Scythians that have been found across the Ukraine and Eastern Russia. And these are some of the richest tombs outside of Egypt that have ever been found. Unfortunately, most of them have been looted, but the Scythians were a nomadic people, a great warrior culture that thrived, several thousand years ago on the steppes. And they made gorgeous ornaments of gold. And these tombs are full of gold objects. I remember reading in the book about a single necklace found in a tomb that was made with over 4 pounds of gold, which is, we're getting up into the King Tut territory there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
while I was reading that whole subject, I came across a Swiss archaeologist named Gino Caspari, who has been working with several computer scientists to identify unknown kurgans or tombs, Scythian tombs, from space using Google Earth. But he was looking at thousands of Google Earth images, and it's a very tedious job. And he was looking for kurgans that maybe had not been discovered and looted, that were still intact. And finally, he got together with these computer scientists, and they put together a very sophisticated computer program that would look at Google Earth images. It's a sort of a neural network type program that can teach itself to look at millions of Google Earth images for kurgans, undiscovered kurgans. And that process is going on right now. And it just shows that, the process of discovery is still happening. There's still many things on the surface of the earth that haven't been found yet and still need to be discovered. I remember my aunt telling me that the Mediterranean is full of Greek and Roman shipwrecks packed with artifacts and maybe even statues and things like that are still undiscovered, lying on the sea floor in the Mediterranean, especially deep water, because water too deep for the fishermen to drag nets over it and wreck everything.
Well, my specialty is ancient Egypt. And so, as the archaeologists there say, you put a shovel in the sand of Egypt and you find something. I think, to circle back to your point about discoveries yet to be made, I think, one of the very subtle but very interesting things about this book is an appendix that we did in the back. And we did a list of new technologies that I think are really, that are, as we speak, revolutionizing the science of archaeology and will continue to do so in the future. And it is interesting that you brought up this idea of looking at images from Google Earth. I know Sarah Parkak very well, who was a National Geographic, I think she still is a National Geographic explorer. She is an Egyptologist and a very big thinker at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And she won the very first TED Talk prize of $1 million for the big idea. So her first claim to fame was she literally wrote the textbook on using satellite images to discover archaeological sites. And she got to thinking when the TED Prize was announced, and she thought, I spent hours and hours and hours and hours in my lab just looking through one satellite image after another, using this filter, using that filter. It's a learning curve. I've kind of figured it out, but it's a lot of woman hours. And her big idea was how to blow this up so that citizen scientists could help her. So what she did, she won the prize. She used that money to sort of gamify this experience. And partnered with the Ministry of Culture in Peru. And so those of us who played the game had a chance to click through parts of satellite images, and they were not identified according to place. So there's no way that looters could use that. But we were supposed to click through tiles, they were called. We're supposed to click through these tiles and see if we saw signs of looting, signs of encroachment, and signs of maybe a site that had not been discovered yet. And, we needed, and there were little boxes for us to click onto and rate these tiles. Well, so literally tens of thousands of us played this game for months on end. And at the end, we ended up discovering 700 archaeological sites or 700 ancient sites that the Ministry of Culture did not have in their database. So the next step, Sarah says, is having artificial intelligence look at the satellite images and do the first sort. And then you turn it over to the citizen scientists and the experts, because of course, nothing can really replace the human eye. But what you want to do is you want to subtract all of those hours and hours and hours that people like Sarah have in the past had to spend in the lab parsing all of this out.
So is this just in Peru, Anne? Was this specific to Peru?
That was just in Peru. Now, Sarah's idea was that was sort of a pilot project, and she was in discussions with India, which would have been fantastic. I mean, there are so many sites and so much history and so many interesting periods. But then COVID hit. And so I think that's been put on hold, but I'm waiting to play the next game. I am waiting to be one of the citizen scientists for India.
I think it's fabulous. I've made several trips to Peru and toured most of the archaeological sites that are available for touring. But, Machu Picchu gets all the attention, but they found another city that's more difficult to get to. I can't remember what it's called. And there's some amazing museums. One of my favorite museums is in Lima. I can't remember the name of it, but it has gorgeous Inca gold and silver, but it has all kinds of weaving and other marvelous stuff. And they found tombs. I mean, Peru, that whole Inca culture wouldn't be just Peru. It would actually be Ecuador down the whole coast. Is probably rife with stuff that like Doug City has been overgrown. And that's true in the Yucatan too, isn't it? I mean, I've been to several of the Yucatan pyramids and all, and it's amazing that anybody ever found them.
Well, the really interesting thing that's going on right now is the use of LiDAR. And I just, in another Zoom thing last night, I just explained to people how LiDAR functions. So for people who don't know, as best I understand, one flies over a rainforest site in an airplane, and one has a special camera and films the canopy of the rainforest and then takes it back to the lab and processes it in a computer with a special software. And, computers are endlessly patient, and they will look at, this little thing and that little thing and that other little thing. And what the computer program does is it peeks through all of the holes between the leaves in the canopy and then builds pictures of what is underneath the canopy. And so they have done LiDAR scans, most especially, I think, in the Petén of Guatemala, of Mayan sites. And the sites have turned out to be much, much larger than anybody had anticipated. And you just could not get enough people with enough time to walk on the ground and discover all of that stuff. So technologies like LiDAR are really revolutionizing the field of archaeology.
Well, that could certainly speak to that, because the Lost City of the Monkey God, it took LiDAR.
Right, and that was the LiDAR. That was a big part of the story.
Well, in fact, the archaeologist that we worked with, Chris Fisher, who is an archaeologist with Colorado State University and a LiDAR expert and also a Mesoamerican archaeologist, has recently founded an organization called Earth Archive, and I'm on the board of this organization. The idea behind it is to LiDAR the entire surface of the Earth.
Oh, cool.
And he's raising money to do it. He's getting money from, hopefully from Google and other map, organizations that are interested in maps. But they're going to start with the Amazon basin, which is 8 countries are involved, and they're working out a lot of the political details now. But the Amazon, the jungle areas of Earth are particularly ripe for discovery because they're so difficult to explore on the ground. I mean, we with the Lost City, of the Monkey God project, we LiDAR'd a jungle valley of 25 square miles in 3 days to a 1 meter resolution.
Mhm.
Now, it would have taken 1,000 years to explore that jungle. It's some of the thickest jungle on earth, lying on top of incredibly steep mountains. I mean, this jungle is so thick that it takes a group of archaeologists or people moving through this jungle with machetes and everything can move only about 3 miles a day. It
Mhm.
is so thick. And it's also full of poisonous snakes and horrible insects, and jaguars and mountain lions. And yet in 3 days, we were able to LiDAR this area and discover hundreds, several hundred, well, 600 or 800 acres of archaeological features scattered through this valley and concentrated in several areas. And then we LiDAR'd 2 other regions of the Mosquitia area of Honduras and found everywhere we looked under the jungle canopy, the undisturbed jungle, we found archaeological features, ruins, cities, plazas.
Doug, that's not really a lot different than looking under the Mediterranean, right? I mean, you have the same problem, which is that you have something covering up and you have to figure out how to penetrate it in order to see what's below it.
That's right. And, it's exciting. When I was a kid, I thought I was going to be an archaeologist and be the first one in an Egyptian tomb or find a lost city or whatever. And then as I got older, I started to realize, well, everything's already been found. But now that I'm even older, I realize that's not true. There's still so much to find. And all these technological tools that we have now to find them didn't exist, 30 or 40 years ago. And the other wonderful thing about these technological tools are that they allow us to explore these areas without disturbing them. We can map an entire city without cutting down trees. We can use ground penetrating radar or magnetometers to map underground features without digging. And we can use ROVs to explore the ocean floor without, lifting artifacts and digging and disturbing ships and things like that. So the new era in archaeology is going to be much less disruptive than the old era was. And I think that's
another wonderful thing. I read about it at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, but I've seen it in Istanbul. If you're below Topkapi, there's 2 or 3 museums down below the cliff where Topkapi is down on the water. And what they've done is they have created a replica of one of the great statues, like Athena or whatever you want to call it, and painted them or, created them the way they were without disturbing the original, but made a copy and painted it so that you can see what it would have looked like then. It wasn't all just white marble like we see it today. So I think the tools that allow people to figure out, it was true in Williamsburg, when they did Williamsburg, they took paint samples and tried to figure out what the real colors in the governor's palace were based upon, whatever they could find behind the wallpaper and all the rest of it. And they're doing the same thing, trying to come up with really the same. Wall Street Journal did a really nice article about the Boston Museum one a week or 2 ago, trying to get to the right colors and the whole bit so that you could see Pallas Athena looking like she was. Just amazing.
That's one of the things that we forget about the ancient world, that so many of these things, ancient Egyptian temples, Greek statues, Roman villas, they were all painted in fabulous color.
Exactly.
And it's really wonderful that people are able that experts are able to recreate these things and give people an experience of these wonderful pieces of art. I'd like to circle back to this idea of looking for things under the rainforest. One of the most exciting things that's going on right now in Central America is represented by one of the chapters in the book. It's a site called El Caño, and it's about an 1.5-hour drive west of Panama City. And it's being dug by a Spanish Panamanian woman who's absolutely meticulous. I mean, just a really top-notch archaeologist. And she did magnetometry on a field where she thought there might be pre-Columbian graves buried, and sort of reading the Spanish conquistadors' journals. These people she was looking for predated that, but what the Spanish conquistadors described, she thought was a culture that had continued on for some centuries. And she thought she had an idea of where she might find these people. We don't even know what their name is. And so when David Coventry and the photographer and I arrived at the site, she and her people, she used magnetometry, identified this place, and began to dig. And when David Coventry and I arrived, they were down 15 feet. And we took a look and we shook our heads because Julia was finding bones and pottery, pottery and bones. Things that only an archaeologist could love. Things that the editors at National Geographic would just roll their eyes at. There used to be a very famous photo editor there who used to see things like that, and she would shake her head and she would just say, "Too brown." And David and I were just saying, "Too brown." And literally days before, the site had to close because the rainy season was beginning and the nearby river was going to overflow its banks and flood the site. Just days before that, the gold started to come up. Just bodies covered with gold, pectorals, cuffs, belts of gold with beads as fat as olives, sashes that were covered with beads of gold that were as small as seeds, earrings, beads wrapped around the lower legs. I mean, it was just fabulous. And National Geographic did a story on it. Yay, it was my story. But the point is that for many generations, the experts were convinced that there really wasn't anything between the Maya in southern Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and there was nothing between that and the Inca down in Peru. And sites like Julia Maya's site in Panama are proving that to be wrong. And so now that they've figured out that there's stuff there, people really are starting to look, which is another really exciting thing that's happening in archaeology. It's a whole different way of thinking of people in the past. Just because a culture had material things that were biodegradable doesn't mean that their civilization was not sophisticated. They mined gold, they worked gold, they made really beautiful things. Their iconography is very unusual and very interesting. And so we have to think about ancient cultures in a very different way and look for them in very different ways. So I think that's another thing that is going to happen in archaeology in the future.
Yeah, that really brings up an interesting point that I think that other archaeologists have said to me, that when you have a culture like the Maya, which is so spectacular, it kind of sucks all the oxygen out of the air, and cultures around it that might be just as equally as interesting are neglected. And I mean, this was certainly true of the lost city that we found in Honduras. That city was about 200 miles west of Copan, or east of Copan, and but it was a different culture. It was a culture influenced by the Maya, but not Maya itself. But because they built in adobe and wood and probably made gorgeous textiles, they had temples and buildings that were as spectacular as any that the Maya had, but that just rotted back into the jungle and disappeared. And so people tended for a long time to dismiss those cultures as not being very interesting. The Maya were much more sophisticated and so forth. But it turns out that that's not true. And the culture that you just mentioned, is certainly one of them. In between the Maya and the Muisca or the cultures of Peru. There are a whole bunch of fascinating and very unknown cultures that really deserve a lot more attention.
Well, Anne, you must be excited by the new discovery in Saqqara. I'm sorry that I missed it. It was last time I was in Egypt was in December of 2019. But Doug, to your point, I hadn't really realized, but as we're wandering around Alexandria, doing some research and so forth, we recognized there are two major tombs in Egypt that have never been discovered that would truly electrify the world. Do you know which two they are?
What, the ones in Saqqara?
No. And well,
you mean
we don't know where they are, but Alexandria was the place that reminded us that they're missing.
people
well,
are looking for Cleopatra and they're looking for Mark Antony. They're also
Well,
looking for Queen
and
Nefertiti.
Alexander, yeah, Alexander himself, his tomb has
Yes.
never been found either. So Cleopatra, Mark Antony, and Alexander the
And
Great.
Alex and Queen Nefertiti. Every time there's a new something or other found in the Valley of the Kings, the whispers start.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look
People
back,
start to say, is it the queen? Is it she? Is it Nefertiti? Everybody's waiting for the moment when Nefertiti somehow sometime comes to life.
because we all want her to look like that gorgeous bust in Berlin.
Of course we do.
You know,
Well,
I was so riveted by it. I kept standing there while people were jostling me. She really is one of the most beautiful. It's just extraordinary. I doubt if she really looked quite that beautiful, but you'd like to think that
I have the inside scoop on that. So in another thing that I do, I am the president of the DC chapter of the American Research Center in Egypt. And so we have a monthly lecture. And we have just recently had a lecture on Zoom given by a Belgian scientist named Dimitri Labouri, who specializes in studying one of the things that he studies is the royal workshop that was found at Amarna, which is the archaeological site of Akhenaten, which was the brand new purpose-built capital city of King Akhenaten, the heretic king, Amenhotep IV, actually, which is how he was born. And then he went a little crazy and changed his name. At any rate, one of the things that the German archaeologists found there when they were excavating in the early 1900s was the workshop of the sculptor that made that very famous bust of Nefertiti. And so he has done a lot of studies of not only that particular bust, but other things found with it. And yes, that bust has been made pretty. It has a stone core and then plaster over that, and the plaster's been modeled to show the queen in just the most spectacular way humanly possible. So yeah, unfortunately, she was not the ravishing thing that we see in the Berlin Museum today.
Well, I only brought it up because people think, it's easy to think that everything in Egypt has been discovered, but imagine how excited we would all be if we found Cleopatra or Mark Antony, or even better, Alexandra. I wanted to ask you too about Sweden. I mean, one of my very favorite things is the Vasa and the Vasa Museum, and you've talked about the Mary Rose, but I think the Vasa is a truly spectacular find.
Somebody asked me about that the other day. I think that was in the running for the book. But we also had the Oseberg ship from Norway, and we couldn't do both.
Okay.
And, you have to choose. And so we chose the Oseberg ship. And, for the next book, we will put in the Vasa. I promise.
You could do that. So Doug, what is in the book that you particularly love besides your own city, the lost city of the monkey god? What struck your fancy the most?
Well, I loved reading about the discovery of Lucy, the ancient Australopithecus africanus, the remarkable fossil that was found by Donald Johanson. And I loved reading about that. That is such a a great story. There are so many amazing stories in this book. It really covers a great sweep of history too. You know, it's organized by discoveries, by the, not when the discoveries were made, but it's organized in a much more interesting way, organized by the dating of the finds. So it starts off 13.6 million years ago, and the bones of our ancestors and those discoveries, and then it moves through to, you know, Otzi the Iceman. That was another fabulous story about the discovery of Otzi, that sort of frozen body that was found right on the border of Austria and Italy in the Alps. An ancient person who'd been discovered as the ice melted, and they found it's the oldest murder that we know, or maybe one of the oldest. There was a spear point in him that probably killed him, probably bled to death, and then he froze, and it was only with global warming and the melting of the ice that his body became visible again. And I've actually seen Otzi myself peering into it in, I believe it was in Bolzano in Italy. He's stored in this climate controlled room that keeps him exactly the way he was, and you peer through thick glass and look at this Iceman. But there are all kinds of great stories about that. Of course, King Tut, the discovery of King Tut's tomb is in there. You know, reminded me, we were talking about discoveries in the Valley of the Kings. I'm sure, Anne, you recall back in the 90s when Kent Weeks discovered the tomb of KV5, of the sons of Ramses the Great, Ramses II. He didn't discover the tomb, but he discovered that what they thought was a small, unimportant tomb, actually there was a cave-in in the back of the single room, and beyond that was the largest tomb in the Valley of the Kings, absolutely huge. And I covered that story for the New Yorker magazine, and I went to Egypt and had a chance to spend a couple of weeks watching this tomb being excavated. At the time, they'd uncovered 97 rooms in this tomb carved out of the mountainside. And most of these rooms hadn't been opened up yet. The tomb was in very bad condition because it had been looted in antiquity. The door was left open and floods had come in. And so there had been cave-ins and so forth. But I remember at a certain point, I asked Kent, I said, you know, you've got all these rooms in this tomb that haven't been opened up yet. And do you think it'd be possible for your workmen to open one of these rooms and for me to be the first one in? Because it's been my dream ever since I was a kid to be the first person, modern person in an ancient Egyptian tomb. And he said, oh, it's unthinkable. Absolutely not. And I said, please? And he said, well, all right. Why not? So we went to the very back of the tomb, and he picked out the most insignificant doorway that he could find, the meanest, the smallest room possible. And he had his workmen clear the top of the lintel, just below the lintel, a hole so I could go into this tomb. There's many feet of debris on the floor of this tomb. And I said, well, how am I going to get in there? There's no ladder around here. And he said, well, the workmen will arrange for that. And they picked me up and shoved me head first through this hole, and I fell into this room. And then they put a light bulb in a cage after me. And Kent said, what do you see? And I said, oh my God, gold. Everywhere, the glint of gold. And there was a silence, and he said, get out of here. That's a bunch of, you don't see anything. Don't do that to me. Oh my God. And when I came back out, he said, boy, you just gave me the worst moment I've ever had as an archaeologist, thinking I'd given away a great discovery to some schmuck of a writer.
You should have said wondrous things, to quote Howard Carter.
Yeah, there was
or whoever it was that was first into King. Was it Carter that was the first into the King?
It was Carter.
Yeah. Well, that's
we don't think of it raining in the Valley of the Kings, but it is. In fact, on the night that King Tut was CAT scanned in January of 2005, it was raining in the Valley of the Kings, and I know because I was there. Yeah. We have to remember about Ramses II. He was, I think, the longest lived ancient Egyptian king.
And had terrible teeth. He had the worst molar. I mean, he had impacted molars. It was just amazing if you look at his mummy to think that he actually survived that long.
They all did. But, you know, he lived into his 90s and he fathered, you know, something like 100 sons. We have no idea how many daughters he had, but I mean, you could just imagine the kind of life that this man led. And you know, and outlived one of the issues with the succession at that time was that he started to outlive his sons. So they started to drop dead. And, you know, he was getting older and older and older, and his sons were dying and dying and getting parked in KV5. And yeah, it created a huge problem for the succession.
So northern Turkey has some wonderful tombs in Amasya, which I have been to. But there's some wonderful stuff around the Black Sea, northern Turkey. You know, how global is your book? Does it range all around the world?
It does. We made a conscious effort to include 6 continents. Couldn't do anything in Antarctica, but there is something from all 6 continents. You know, one of the stories that I was involved in was a chapter that was based on a story from the magazine called Bulgaria's Gold Rush. And I think it was done in like 2006, 2007. What is happening is archaeologists in Bulgaria started to find the gold-filled tombs of Thracian kings. And Bulgaria is in such a precarious economic and political situation that the looters are just all over the place in Bulgaria. And so this mad scramble ensued between the archaeologists on one side, who were trying to excavate the graves and get the information that you can extract from an intact burial on the one hand, and the looters on the other, who were just going around, you know, putting shovels in the earth and trying to get up whatever they could. And so, you know, we did a story about that whole, you know, tug of war between the two sides, and also sort of wove in some information about the Thracians, which we found very interesting. The Greeks did not have favorable things to say about the Thracians. The Thracians were their enemies. And so they thought the Thracians were really quite uncivilized. But here you have these people who were fabulous goldsmiths, and they made absolutely wonderful wine, which their descendants continue to do. And they gave the Greeks the god Dionysus. So, you know, what's not to like? I mean, they were not uncivilized. They were really quite amazing.
Sir Leonard Woolley and Sir Max Mallowan did some wonderful work over around the Euphrates. There's some of that again in Berlin, and also the British Museum, and of course there's the Rosetta Stone and all. But moving out of these drier lands, Doug, and do you think that the melting of the permafrost is going to reveal things to us that we, you know, can't even imagine?
Well, yes, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of my favorite stories in the book came from another magazine story that I did. I heard about an archaeological dig going on the shore of the Bering Sea. And the deal is in Alaska that the permafrost is thawing, and the land is sinking, and the Bering Sea is rising. So it's sort of a trifecta of horribleness for sites that could be archaeological sites. This particular town involved in this excavation was called Quinnipiac, and the Native Alaskans who live there are the Yupik, and they had brought in archaeologists when they noticed the Bering Sea eroding away the side of an ancestral village. So all sorts of things were going overboard. There were masks carved from driftwood. There were harpoons carved from caribou antler. There were ornaments carved from walrus tusk. There was basketry, because it had been frozen in the permafrost for so long. If you get it out of the ground quickly enough, there were baskets where you could still see the woven grass. And the lead archaeologist, Rick Connect, called me over one day and he said, here, I got something to show you. And he had a little sort of muddy ball in his hand and he broke it open and there was green grass inside. And he said, this grass was cut when Shakespeare walked the earth.
Ooh.
So yes, I know, goosebumps. So what happened to this village? They think it was a time called the Little Ice Age in the mid 1600s, and the Yupik were fighting each other for food. And so one group of Yupik had attacked this ancestral village and probably killed everybody. There were skeletons found in the communal home. Yeah. And so all of that was left to be, taken over and frozen in the permafrost. And it is all emerging now. And so the archaeologists are working absolutely as quickly as they possibly can to get everything out of that site before it rots, before either the Bering Sea takes it off the front end of the site. They've lost, I think in 7 or 8 years, they've lost something like 39 feet off the front edge of the site. So there's that danger, and also trying to get all this stuff up. The basketry, they've found dog collars made from woven grass, just extraordinary stuff. And Rick Connect, the lead archaeologist, said there are archaeological sites up and down the coast of Alaska going overboard, just like this ancient site.
Oh, you forgot a Lasso Madar, which I've actually been to, which is in Newfoundland, I think. But it seems to me that with Greenland thawing, I haven't been any farther north than the capital, Nuuk, whatever it is, but there are now cruises going around Greenland. It would seem to me that there's a lot of Viking potential in places like Greenland that moving up to the Arctic Circle that, are going to surprise us. There's not that much available right now, but I would say as global climate is warming, we're going to find a lot of stuff.
Absolutely.
Interesting. So did you have to balance your book between the obvious stuff and the not so well known to make it interesting?
Yes. Yes. I mean, there were obvious things. Okay. You have to put Machu Picchu. You have to put Stonehenge. You have to put King Tut. You have to put the terracotta warriors from China. You have to put the Indus Valley cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. I mean, those are just obvious. But, there are subtler things, things that I really love. There's a site in England called the Must Farm, and it is about 3,000 years old. And it was found in a quarry in the eastern part of England, a quarry for clay to make bricks. And this quarry is very famous. The clay from that quarry made a lot of the brick houses that were constructed during the Victorian era. And so they know, when they dig there, that stuff does come up. And they kind of saw something funky, called an archaeologist. He assessed that and said, oof, gotta dig. So they blocked off that part of the site, and the archaeologists came in and dug all winter. They dug for, I think, 16 straight months, right through the winter, right through the snow and the rain. And what they found is a village of about 5 houses. And for some reason it burnt. The houses were wattle and daub. They had thatched roofs, maybe a fire sent off a spark. You can just imagine a roof goes up and then boom, all 5 houses are burning. But the thing is, people left. I mean, they just ran away. And so they left everything right there. And the archaeologists were able to find things like, for instance, a bowl with a spoon in it that had the remains of the porridge that somebody was eating when he or she ran away. Now, these are not things, this is not King Tut's mask. It's nothing that a magazine editor is going to say, gotta have a photograph of that in the magazine. But conceptually, this is so exciting. Can you imagine the last meal of the person who ran away when her house was burning down. I mean, it's just extraordinary. So that is another chapter in the book. Another chapter that I really love is about a thing called the Antikythera mechanism. It is one of the, yes, it is one of the most sophisticated computer-like machines ever found from the classical world. And it's one of these things also that was probably on a ship, classical era ship that was going from somewhere in the Greek world, probably to Italy, carrying this thing, and sank, and was found, I think, by sponge divers in the early 1900s. And so as technologies are, and so, they've got it up in pieces. I think initially there were 3 big pieces, and then it's been kind of cleaned, and, so it's kind of come apart. But at any rate, they've used a lot of computer simulations, and they think that this was a circle, and it had levers and cranks, and you pulled and pushed the levers and turned the cranks, and it was a star clock. And so it could show the configuration of the known planets and the known constellations, and the dates of the next Olympic Games, and the dates of this and the dates of that, and you just trying to, it was a calendar. And so there have been lots of studies done on this, and it is just when you see this presented with what they're able to do now on computer 3D simulation of how this thing functioned, it was just extraordinary. Phases of the moon, solar eclipses, you name it. This thing would tell you what that stuff would, when that stuff was going to happen in the ancient world. And
we probably should call Patrick up, but I was thinking, we're skimming over to Angkor Wat, or I'm trying to remember what would be really interesting in Japan or Korea. I mean, it's really hard to represent the whole world in 100. 100 seems like a lot, but it's actually very few.
It is. And, we had a lot of horse trading at the end, and, there were some things that I love that didn't make the cut. And I'm sure, everybody else working on the project had the same thought. But having said that, I look at the book now and I'm just really happy with it. To circle back to Doug's point about the chapters on the early humans, those things aren't archaeology in the traditional sense, but we included them anyway. They're anthropology. But what I think that added such a wonderful dimension to the book, because what we have now is a really profound sweep of human experience from the earliest traces of our early ancestors right through to the sinking of the Titanic in April 1912. So it really is an extraordinary record of how smart and inventive and really how resilient humans are. And, what I've been saying to people is that, it really is a wonderful thing to remember, that our ancestors went through some really tough times because, they didn't have vaccines. They just had to wait until plagues killed people. And yet they survived, and they created beautiful things, and they left us wonderful legacies. And so, I think we can hope to do the same thing, because we descend from all of those people who made all of those beautiful things in the book.
That's a wonderful tribute. I'm going to call Patrick up, but Doug, is there anything you'd like to say before Patrick pops up here to relay questions?
I think that was a wonderful statement to leave with our audience before we go to questions.
I do too. Patrick, are you there? Hello. He's working on this and that. There he is.
Yeah, no, fascinating conversation. And actually, I have a couple of people agree with me that Anne, you would make the perfect audiobook narrator. Are you?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Well, sign me
yes.
up.
Very dulcet tones.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Is there going to be an audio version of it, or is there one already in the process?
I was told by my editor that there is, and I volunteered to read it. But I don't know what has happened to that project. So, perhaps not for this, but maybe for the next one. I am currently working on a book about ancient Egypt. So maybe for that, who knows?
Wow, maybe one of these great tombs will be discovered while you're working on your book. How exciting. is that?
Maybe. One can only hope.
Oh, I mean, don't you think, Doug, that it was really, if these haven't been found ever, that it'll take something like LiDAR, or some great technology to find them? They're obviously
well,
so incredibly
Egypt
well hidden.
I'm sure as Anne would attest, Egypt is, people think Egypt's been totally explored, everything's been found, but actually there's a lot there that hasn't been found. There's a lot of sand has covered things up. And really early archaeologists focused on the spectacular tombs, the pyramids, tombs of the pharaohs and the nobles. But now a lot of Egyptian archaeologists are working on simple people's homes. Who were the people who built the pyramids? Where did they live? What did they eat? And so they're really piecing together, doing some fascinating archaeology on the common people of Egypt, which we really don't know all that much about.
I'm really hoping that Mongolia will finally reveal which Khan is it that we've never found. Is it Genghis or Kublai?
Genghis Khan's tomb is never.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the great archaeological lodestones, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting, we have a satellite orbiting Mars, which has LiDAR'd the entire surface of Mars. Now, it's not a very deep, not a very high resolution LiDAR, but it's pretty much LiDAR'd the entire surface of Mars. But we have not LiDAR'd the surface of our own planet. And that's what this Earth Archive hopes to do. It's going to cost billions of dollars, but it'll create a record of the Earth as it is right now, so that we can see what changes are taking place in the future. We can see what glaciers have melted. It'll also reveal thousands, tens of thousands of archaeological sites, so that we'll have a record of those before, many of them are looted or destroyed just from the deforestation and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, LiDAR is a revolutionary technology. And by the way, it is the prime technology that's going to be used for self-driving cars.
Wow. Well, I mean, it's a wonderfully exciting era because, as you say, we thought it was done, and now we have all these new tools and it's not. Patrick, are there other questions? I know that was a comment from you.
Yeah, there is a question. Let's see here. Debbie asks, sorry, that keeps moving on me. Does anyone ever object to burial grounds being excavated for science? We talk about the ethics of this, and I know
Yes,
repatriation is a big concern here in the Southwest, right, Doug?
well, that's right. There's there are very strict laws about excavating burials in the United States, and each culture is different. Some cultures don't mind it at all and encourage it, and in other cultures it's taboo. I mean, working in Israel can be very difficult because of the presence of human remains and the religious sensitivities. But in other countries, it's not like, for example, in South America and in Mexico and in many countries, excavating tombs and human remains is not considered to be a bad thing, and people actually welcome it. So, but it is archaeologists for many years rode roughshod over indigenous people's beliefs and their culture and just dug wherever they wanted and took whatever they wanted. But now archaeology is completely transformed, and archaeologists are very sensitive to those issues. And in fact, many of the archaeologists now belong to those indigenous cultures and are working to reveal their own histories. And that's the way it should be.
That Alaska site that I worked on, there were human remains, and there were apparently great discussions between the archaeologists on one hand and the local people from the village of Quinnahook on the other about how those human remains were going to be handled. In fact, they were held for quite a long time in the building that was sort of the community center. And that was where the archaeologists were working. And that's where photographer Erica Larson and I were sleeping. And so we found out later on that we were sleeping right down the hall from these human remains, which was a little daunting. But I think the plans were for the Yupik people in Quinnahook to respectfully bury these human remains after the archaeologists were done with them. The Yupik were going to take care of their ancestors, and that was the deal that was made. And in fact, there was that was not a big focus of the story that I wrote, because people just they just wanted to be discreet about that.
Right. It's funny. Doug, you might know this, one of the Hopi sites, I think it's called Homolovi. It's right off the freeway. It's interesting because there's a lot of pottery shards that are just scattered everywhere. And I'm not sure if, individuals are kind of repatriating some of these pieces from various other sites. It's very interesting.
I don't know that site. I mean, I know Homolovi, but I don't know most of those early Puebloan sites. The amount of pottery shards is absolutely incredible. And you go to Hawiku, which is a ruin some distance from Zuni, and it's just like a giant mountain of pottery shards.
Right. Let's see, one or two more questions. Let's see, Spencer asks, where did the inspiration come for the cover?
Gosh, I don't know. The National Geographic graphics team in books.
It's a beautiful cover.
It really
very
is.
dramatic.
That's
Yeah.
that's from King Tut's tomb, isn't it?
I believe so.
Was it the pectoral from King Tut?
Yeah.
I think it might be. Yeah.
Now let's see if there's anything else. No, let's see. Will there be a second volume?
I don't know.
Depends upon how this one does, right?
Well, I guess, yes. It depends on the editors at National Geographic Books. Do they want to do this again?
And it's a really interesting question. Sometimes it seems like there should be, but then somehow or other, once it's done, interest kind of filters out. But you could do endless volumes if you really think about it.
Well, I suppose one could do one, wait some years and see what else comes to light. And, with all of this new technology that we've been talking about, surely there will be new fabulous things to write about. So, just wait a little while.
Yeah, I think that's very likely the case. I think, it's exciting to think that there's some great discovery right over the horizon that as we're speaking, we don't quite know. And Doug's wonderful project, board. It's great that you're on the board with that. How do you have time? I mean, you're on the Authors Guild board and you're writing 2 books a year. And how do you have time to serve on the board?
Well, they kind of put me on that board without really telling me, or they told me, but I resisted it, but they really wanted me on that board. But I think it's an amazing project. It absolutely is an extraordinary project, and I was able to raise some money for them from some wealthy people here in Santa Fe. But I mean, I really believe in it. I think it's very important for us to document the Earth now before things change too much. I mean,
there's no question that, there are going to be some dramatic changes. We're here in the Southwest and it's all desert right now, but once it was the sea, or we wouldn't have all this sandstone and the rest of it. So, the Earth does go through these enormous changes, and none of us is going to live long enough to see but that much of it, yet it's accelerating. So who can tell? Maybe we'll be beachfront property one day, Patrick, when California falls into the ocean after the
Well,
earthquake.
it is kind of scary when we seem to swap the summers with Oregon this year. You know,
We did.
Oregon getting 115, 116 degree, some of those towns in Portland.
And we had a really rainy and relatively cool August
That's
while
right.
everybody was sweltering in Boston. So it's very hard to know. This has really been a treat. Anne, thank you so much for joining us and for editing this marvelous book. And Doug, always a joy to see you. And I'm
Yes.
sorry you're about to enter into slave labor, but let me repeat, for those of you who pre-ordered the book, please be patient because Doug is now going to have to slit open the wrappings and sign every book and then repack them. Then they have to come here and then we have to do something. So it may be a project, given its size, that is going to take longer than we really anticipated. But how great that so many of you were interested in the book. I love it.
I'll fly over to Santa Fe to do it, Doug, if you need some help.
You
No,
volunteer.
I need some help. When I sign books at the Poison Pen, you put them in a production line for me. But now
Yeah,
I'm all by myself.
we'll bring
I'm
it
actually
As I
through.
said, if I had known you were going to reveal this book to the world, I would have suggested that you just come here. Would have been dramatically easier all the way around for you. But anyway, we will get to see Doug in February 15th with Diablo Mesa. And we're excited about that. So if you missed out on a signed copy of Lost Cities, Ancient Tombs, you can get on the wait list. And you know what? It'll read the same without a signature. So you don't have to actually wait for Doug to sign it to enjoy it. I think it'd make a super Christmas gift and a wonderful gift for teenagers to really get them, interested and excited. I love books that have such a wide age range that, can appeal to people across generations. So thank you all for joining us tonight and bye.
Thank you, Barbara.
Good evening.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you for inviting me. This was fun.
It was